Hello, Broadcasting Scotland, and welcome to our broadcast from Dumfries, where Joe Goodburn will introduce what we're doing today.
Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this beautiful Dumfries location, Moat Brae. I'm here in my role as the Vice Chair of the European Movement in Scotland. Welcome you all to our event and to those of you who are joining us online. And I would encourage you, if you're here as a non-member of the European Movement, if you feel moved to join us today, all the details required are on this little card on your seat. So it is a real pleasure for me to be here. I'm living in Fife at the moment, so I'm not often in this part of Scotland, and it's looking particularly beautiful today. But it's a real pleasure for me to reconnect with Philip Rycroft. We were colleagues a long time ago in the Scottish office, and Philip went on to do some really important European jobs in his later career. In particular, in the mid-90s, he was part of the cabinet staff to Leon Britton, one of the British commissioners in Brussels at the time. And then, I'm not quite sure as such a pro-European how he did it, but latterly he was the senior civil servant running the UK government's department to exit the EU. A very demanding job, which we'll hear all about in due course. And it's also very nice to see David again, who was the BBC's Europe correspondent in the mid-90s when I was in Brussels researching and eventually setting up the Scottish representation there, which is now known as Scotland House and is a very popular place for events and learning all about Scotland. And I'm sure, like you are all very much looking forward to hearing what these two have to say in our discussion, which comes at such a vital time for us all to be considering the best options for our movement, to be promoting and campaigning for what can be the most effective ways to ensure that Scotland maintains its really close links with our European friends and neighbours, and importantly, our ties to what is the European acquis, the laws and regulations that have come from Brussels, and the policies that for Scotland have made such a positive difference over the many decades that we've been members, and we mustn't lose that. So it's with a huge thanks to David Ralston and Phil Carlson and the local group of the European Movement in Scotland down here in southwest Scotland that we have a wonderful event in store for you today. Thank you both very much.
Great, Joe, thank you. Yeah. It's great to be here. I've just tweeted about being in the birthplace of Peter Pan, gazing out at sunlit uplands. Brexit, fantasy, and reality, which we'll talk about over the next hour or so. Joe, thanks for reminding me of my time in Brussels in the 90s. I was a BBC correspondent, and obviously scrupulously impartial. So just to be absolutely transparent and open with you right now, I'm ex-BBC, and I think Brexit was the most catastrophic blunder any country has ever made. It's a source of grief and of anger that began that night in 2016 and lasts to this day. And I'm just going to highlight two. There are many, many reasons, but I want to pick on two which we might get into in our discussion and the Q&A. One is that I think the campaigning by the Leave lot for Brexit ushered in a new low of sort of institutionalized mendacity when you could just say anything. 80 million Turks are going to come here, for example. And then the other one, which I find really wounding, and I'm delighted to see my two nieces here, the younger generation. The horizons of the younger generation, rather than encompassing 30 countries, are now limited to one. And I just think that's a crying shame. So I just wanted to put that out there as the interviewer today, because the star attraction is Philip, obviously, just to be absolutely clear where I'm coming from. So Philip, I've just briefly introduced Philip, as Joe said, actually, as a civil servant, ran the ministry that was set up to get us out of the European Union. And I know because I've read your work and we've spoken recently, you were not really enthusiastic personally about taking us out of the European. I mean, what was it like day by day having, as a professional civil servant, to deliver an outcome that you yourself passionately detested?
It's a very good question. It was a question that not just I, but a lot of my colleagues were asking constantly through that time. Clearly the sympathies of this audience made very clear in response to your first comment. Sometimes when I'm introduced these days for the different roles I've done in front of audiences, that when I get to was the permanent secretary of the Department for Exiting the EU, there's a sort of sharp intake of breath.
And people aren't quite sure.
I'm sort of the pantomime villain, clearly. But I was a civil servant. As a civil servant, my job and the job of my team was to support the government of the day to enact its policies, and that's what we did. And that was the professional ethic, and I made it absolutely clear to my team that I was not going to ask them, I didn't expect them to ask me, how they voted, and I never wanted to hear them ask any of their teams how they'd voted. Our job was to work for the government of the day, and that's what we did. And we did that through thick and thin. We did that under considerable pressure, because we were dealing with a project where the government had really no idea where it was going to take it. And the government itself was very, very divided. My previous job had been running the civil service side of Nick Clegg's office when he was Deputy Prime Minister. And as part of that job, I sat in the back row of Cabinet for 3 years. So I saw Cabinet operating at very close quarters. I'm going to say that Cabinet, despite the fact there was 2 political parties in the room, was less divided than the May Cabinet. So this was not ideal circumstance to be a civil servant.
So let's pick up on one of those points, which was that the Leave campaign won, but didn't have a plan. Now, what did that mean in terms of sort of government machinery, what you were tasked to deliver?
A sort of blind panic almost at the start. Notoriously, David Cameron did not allow the civil service to plan for a Leave outcome. It was a bit the same. Because of the job I had in the Clegg office, I was the lead Whitehall official on the UK government's what they did through the Scottish referendum campaign. He did the same there. He would not allow us to plan for a yes outcome for that campaign. So when and obviously that worked out for him, when it came to EU referendum, there was no plan in place.
So there was no government plan, but there was no Leave plan either.
No. So you're dealing with a multiplicity, in a sense, of possible Leave outcomes. And the various elements of the Leave campaign, it wasn't a united campaign. They were never forced into a position where they, in a sense, had to say, this is what we're going to do. So people were voting into a bit of a vacuum. And then when we confront this decision, we have to start making up pretty much on day one. Jeremy Hayward, then Cabinet Secretary, slightly cheated on the Prime Minister's instructions. And we did, literally in the 2 or 3 weeks before the vote, he had some very, very private meetings of sort of quite senior folk in the civil service just to say, what do we do? And, you know, the key point at that is... Was
that because there was a sense in the civil service at that level that the answer might be Leave?
We were, I have to say, like most people, if the bias was anywhere, it was going to be a vote to remain. I remember talking to some fairly senior cabinet ministers a day or two before the vote, and their polling was saying the outcome would be 52-48, but the other way around. But if you think about it, at that moment, what is your concern? Your concern is about a run on the pound. It's about how the markets respond. It's about whether people worry about whether planes will still fly. So we had to, that's the little bit of planning we did do. But then we're gazing across this unknown landscape, knowing that the challenge was absolutely enormous and we were going to have to make it up as we went along.
It is amazing, isn't it? I mean, you know, over the years, contacts I've had and dealings with senior civil service people, it's all about contingencies. You know, what happens if there's nuclear war? What happens if whatever, you know, and terror attack or something. Yeah. But on this absolutely monumental moment, and talking to people who were pro-Leave, there was a deliberate choice, I think, not to have a plan because it would be picked apart by Remainers.
Exactly. I think if there was one big mistake that David Cameron made, I think
actually there are several, but anyway.
Well, it would have been, I think it would have been very difficult to avoid a referendum, but the terms on which that referendum was held, I think he missed the opportunity to force the debate in a way which gave people voting in this country a clearer idea of actually what they were voting for. So we had that, do you remember the competencies of the EU exercise under the coalition, which was meant to set out all of the benefits and disbenefits of membership? Much to the irritation of a lot of folk in the Cameron cabinet at the time, actually it was saying serially that the benefits outweigh the disbenefits. If we'd been able to get that debate in a sort of independent way into the public space, giving people the option to look into that future, and for the Leave side to say, this is the sort of Leave we would be advocating, the result may have been different, but he chose not to go down that path.
We're going to have to sort of fast forward in the narrative, obviously, because otherwise we could... You're all okay to stay for 5 hours, are you? Because obviously we could... I mean, so Cameron resigns, there's then all that sort of leadership stuff that happens, and then Theresa May, a Remainer, ends up in charge. And I'd always thought, well, she's going to have to prove how Brexity she really is, right? And then I think I'd always thought her Florence speech was the one where she laid out her red lines. But I think when we spoke before, you said actually it was the Lancaster House speech. Now, just remind perhaps all of us what she did, because even at that point, it wasn't yet known what Brexit was. No. Might we stay in the single market? Might we stay in the customs union? Might we do something else? And then she stood up. Talk us through what happened and what it was like for you on the inside.
Well, it was, and there's a lot of Brexiteers saying we will be trading with Europe on exactly the same basis that we trade today.
Which sort of meant single market, did it?
Absolutely, it had to mean single market. There was no other alternative. That's what you wanted. So, Mrs May, you're absolutely right. And she points Johnson, Liam Fox and David Davis to three critical departments to prove her Brexit credentials. She starts talking about Brexit means Brexit. You remember that?
And a red, white and blue Brexit.
Red, white, blue, all that's it.
Yeah.
And the two critical moments. One is when she set the Article 50 clock ticking, because that immediately put the UK on the back foot, because you're then into a timetable that you've lost control of. But then she set out, and this happened more or less the same time in early 2017, that she set out in the Lancaster House speech her red lines. And as soon as she says no freedom of movement, you're out the single market. You could have stayed in the customs union, but she ruled that out as well. But the interesting thing about that speech, she also said no return to the borders of the past in respect of on the island of Ireland. And anybody who understood the dynamic of this could see that was immediately a contradiction. And in a way, the story of the remainder of the May premiership was her efforts to extricate herself from the contradiction in her red lines. But I remember conversation, I wasn't in Dexter at that time, I remember conversations with my team saying, she said no freedom of movement, we're on what wasn't then explained as the Barnier steps, but the result of that would be something like the Brexit we've got.
So when you heard the speech, I mean, what ran through your mind, or heart, or guts?
I can tell you very precisely what was running through my mind at the time, because my job at that moment was running something called the UK Governance Group. So my job was to advise Cameron and Oliver Letwin and others on constitution devolution issues. In other words, to hold the United Kingdom together. So my job was to think about this union and looking at the run into that Lancaster House speech. Quite a lot of debates in the House. My big worry is about the impact that would have on the dynamic of the UK Union. But you could see the politics of this driving Mrs May into a place. And then when the Article 50 letter comes out, the clock starts ticking. That my heart sank because there was no returning from that.
I remember a column that Matthew Paris wrote, I think just after the referendum. He said that there'll be no limit to the demands of the so-called Europhobe ultras. I mean, there's never enough. And that must have made your job just harder and harder, because there was this howling pressure for a true Brexit, a clean Brexit, and all the rest of it.
There was a lot of assumptions that you could essentially have your cake and eat it at that time. So Brexiteers who hadn't really thought this through.
Yes, I forgot it was cakeism, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Right,
you could assume that you could essentially recreate our trading conditions with you, because that's what they would want. You remember David Davis on all it takes is BMW or Audi, whatever, to ring up Merkel, and then it'll be sorted. This was going to be very easy. Our job in DEXU we weren't running the negotiation, that was done by Ollie Robbins and his team, but we were doing all the preparations for Brexit on every other front. And it was our job to go to the ministers and say, look, the Brexit you're heading for will mean a trade border with the EU. That's the very, very simple fact of the matter, and these are the consequences of that. And we had a lot of denial of that. We said, no, it's going to be fine because it's their interest to do a good deal. And I said, we will be a third country, and as a third country, our traders will face these barriers. And that is ineluctable. That is a consequence of the decision you've taken. And it was really that, in like 30 seconds, was 2 years or so of my life to persuade ministers to get that evidence in front of the right people in government.
I'm sensing a sort of collective, deep, agonised sigh in this room, that kind of recollection. And you mentioning David Davis, I know you didn't work directly on the negotiations with the EU, but that image of the minister in charge of the Brexit negotiations with the EU turning up in Brussels, and on one side of the desk there was the suave, well-organised figure of Michel Barnier, flanked by together-looking sort of officials, and very neat piles of sort of dossiers ready for business. And on the other side of the table was David Davis with nothing, not even a little notebook. And I mean, for you as a professional, sort of not only seeing that, but knowing the reality of it inside, just must have been horribly painful.
Yeah, and there was a huge...
Because there was sort of lack of professionalism, wasn't there?
Underestimation on the UK side of the negotiating capabilities of the EU, and also of the cohesion of the EU. There was an assumption that somehow you could divide and rule.
Or you could pick off a few countries.
You could deal with Germany and France, and then everybody else would follow. So that sort of... And the team that was doing the negotiation did not have deep European experience. So they were sort of learning on the job. And that was a deliberate decision by Mrs May to put into that team folk who hadn't come out of the UK permanent representation or hadn't had big jobs dealing with the EU, because of the fear that would suggest she was being contaminated by Remainer sentiment.
Yes.
So the odds were always a little bit tilted. And you've seen the Barnier diaries, you've seen the Barnier account of all of this. But the EU is a ferociously good negotiator. As Joe mentioned, I was in the Britain cabinet for a couple of years dealing with trade issues. So I was on that side of the fence dealing with third countries. And the EU negotiates very, very hard, or the Commission on its behalf, in the interests of the member states and for nobody else. That's what it does.
It also reminds me of a thought that often sort of pops up, that in Brexit circles, I mean, going way back, but particularly more recently, a kind of inability to comprehend the EU as a viable entity with its own agenda, with its objectives. And, it's either portrayed as a sort of evil superstate or a sort of rather shambolic bunch of sovereign nations who will fall apart at the drop of a hat. And, of course, neither analysis is right. Yeah.
No, I think you get a lot of that, and you get that sort of translated discourse you still see today. The EU needs us, so they're going to come begging for all sorts of concessions from the UK. On the other hand, the EU is doing us down, is imposing unnecessary constraints on the UK. You can't have it both ways. This is positing the EU as two really very different things. It can't be both at the same time.
Should we fast forward again to sort of your, I suppose, final period in Whitehall? Just talk us through what we ended up with, actually.
So the job I had to do, through all of that really tough politics, when Mrs May was having those meaningful votes and the rest of it, what we saw looming on the horizon was a possibility it would fall out with no deal. And we understood the consequences of no deal. This is going straight
and of course some people wanted no deal.
Exactly. This is going straight from membership of the single market to trading on WTO terms. Some said, well, that'll be absolutely fine. We were saying, actually, it won't be fine. And here's why. And my job as a civil servant, I really want to emphasise this, was to get that proper evidence of the likely consequences of this in front of ministers. And if there's two things I'm proud of from what the team did at that time, was one, we produced an economic impact assessment of the different forms of Brexit. And some of you might remember this because it was in the public domain. It was published in November 2018. And it said that any outcome, EEA, the sort of deal we've got, no deal, were all worse than staying in. And that said that, and that, if you think about the pressure we were under, not to have that analysis in the public domain, and there was never a similar thing done around the Johnson deal, that we stuck with that and we got that out there. I was very proud of that. And the other thing we did
actually, can we just pause on there, because we'll come back to the reaction. I mean, the way that report was greeted as a sort of continuation of Project Fear. It's a load of sort of closet remainers in the civil service dreaming stuff up, wasn't it? I mean, we might come back to that as a topic.
Yeah, no, and so the other big thing we did was, because we understood the damage that no deal would do, we were determined that Cabinet should look at that as a sort of comprehensive dossier of all of those impacts. I was working for a Secretary of State at the time. We'd lost Davis. We're on the second iteration, which was Dominic Raab, who was a little bit sceptical about what we were putting forward, if I could put it mildly. But again, we stuck with our guns.
He was the one who didn't know where Dover was in relation to Calais, right? Is that right?
It was more it was one of our main points that so much UK trade goes through that artery. And what we were actually saying is we're going to lick the French hands on the jugular vein of British trade. And if the French chose to kick up about this, they could have stopped, still can. Anyway, that's another story. So we eventually got that, again, late 2018, we got that paper in front of ministers at a senior enough level. And indeed, that paper again got into the public domain because Anna Soubry in early 2019 had one of those humble addresses. Do you remember the humble addresses? Bane in my life, which made me, we had to produce loads of stuff for Parliament we didn't necessarily want to produce for Parliament, which set out in pretty stark terms. So the job I had to do was to say to ministers, you go down that track, this is the likely outcome, and we did that job. And of course, fortunately, a no-deal Brexit was avoided, but that's what we would do. It was, and alongside all of that, then planning to mitigate the effects of that. A big job.
God, absolutely amazing. Should we talk about kind of where we are now and start casting ahead? I mean, you know, one does hear Brexit supporters clutching at straws about all kinds of advantages. Rees-Mogg had a go with road signs, one or two others I've heard. Just in an overall sense, what is it worse than you feared? Is it roughly what you'd predicted would happen?
It is, I think, more or less where we thought it would be. There was one of the things that Brexiteers say was that George Osborne, pre-referendum, was saying that this would be a catastrophe, you know, everything would collapse the day after the vote, which was always an exaggeration. But they've sort of used that to say, well, that didn't happen, so it's been fine. But if you go back to our piece of economic analysis we did, said the impact of Brexit, the sort of Brexit we got, were between 4 and 6% impact on GDP over the medium term. And most economic analysis would agree with that. And most analysis now would say that's actually where we're heading. So this is very, very simple. What you've done is put huge non-tariff barriers between the UK and our major market for both imports and exports. And that, if you like, is acting like a drag anchor on the UK economy. It has slowed us down. It will reduce productivity growth. We will be poorer than we otherwise would have been. Of course, there are some advantages to Brexit. We've come out of the CAP, which, the Common Agricultural Policy, which was nobody's idea of a sensible way of running agriculture over time, though was improving. We can manage our own fisheries again, and whether we do it better or worse than the EU is a moot point. We could be more agile in regulatory terms around various things. You can put a crown stamp on a pint glass again. Actually, you could probably have done that pre-Brexit anyway. So, but there are some overarching, and we can do our own trade deals. We don't want to talk about trade deals. But when you put all of that in the mix with that big impact, that 4% hit on GDP, there is absolutely no doubt in my mind where the balance of advantage lies. But this will play out over time. We are, although Brexit's done, everybody's bored of it, apart from folk like in this room and me and others. But actually, Brexit is going to take a very long time to get completely done, because you're seeing this massive adjustment through the UK economy, supply chains, how manufacturers, service businesses adjust to these new realities, and that's just going to take a long time.
Yeah, it's generational in that sense. And we haven't touched on the damage to science or arts or cultural exchanges or young people, really. Scotland voted to stay. I think it's actually kind of wonderfully reassuring and inspirational to see the strength of movement that continues today in Scotland with gatherings like this. What before we get to the future, what's Brexit meant for Scotland?
So you have to, one of the things to remember about my work at the time, I was still running, alongside the Brexit department, I was still running the UK governance group. So my mum said, "What are you doing now, dear?" I'd say to her, "Well, Mum, I'm trying to keep us in one union while taking us out of another one." And she sort of understood that. But this was, this was a very, very immediate concern. You remember the day after the referendum, Nicola Sturgeon standing up saying this is a material change in circumstance, so therefore justifying a campaign to have another referendum. And so it put immediate pressure on the workings of the union. And we had a really tough job to hold things together in terms of just the normal interaction between the governments in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland and the UK government. And again, it's no trade secret to say that didn't work very well through 2016 and most of 2017. Began to improve a bit towards the end of my time, but was extraordinarily difficult. But what Brexit did, and we could see this, as we'd just come out of a referendum where the result had been a lot tighter in terms of Scottish referendum than anybody had anticipated. We knew the union was in a pretty fragile state, and we have this enormous shock. And what that shock does, it blows up the ambiguity that has always shrouded the nature of the relationship with Scotland within the UK union. Is it a union of law, or is it a union of consent? And what Brexit did was to say to people in Scotland and to Northern Ireland, not Wales, as Wales voted leave, but I'm sorry guys, even though this is an existential decision for the United Kingdom, the vote of the majority will have us. And that fact is now with us forever. You can't undo that. So Brexit, my perception was at the same time, it made independence more likely because a lot of people were very angry about that. But at the same time, it made independence of Scotland more difficult because by coming out of the EU, unlike in 2014, an independent Scotland would have a choice to make between staying in the UK internal market and joining the EU single market. And I'm sorry to say to folks, some won't like me saying this, there is no way around that choice.
Well, that might pivot us to looking ahead, because I think, the sentiment in this room and among many, and the polls are now very clear that a majority, at the very least, want a closer relationship, if not to rejoin. Should we just pick through what the options are and realistically what we might see? I mean, I think a lot of people looked to a potential future Starmer government to sort of at least be more sensible about relations with the EU. but actually he seems to be straining every sinew to look as Brexity as he possibly can, rejecting even the offer of freedom of movement for 4 years for under 30s. And I suppose for narrow political reasons he feels the need to do that. So what for you, this is with your civil service mind, what are the plausible options that face us? I mean, okay, let's say Starmer gets in. Can we sort of do some very technical, rather dull, but potentially useful new agreements to ease trade or something? What can happen?
Can I preface my answer with a historian's response first? That just if you step back from this, if you look at 1,000 years of, I was going to say British, but actually mainly English, so I doff my cap to a Scottish audience, of essentially policy towards the near abroad. What's that been about? It's been about stopping there being one dominant power on the continent. And if you fast forward into the 20th century, the decision that Macmillan and Wilson and Heath took, recognising coming out of empire, our future was ineluctably linked to our near abroad in terms of security and defence, economically as well as culturally and all the rest of it. And that remains true today and will remain true for the foreseeable future. And indeed, in a way, Brexit timing was extraordinarily bad. Look what's happened since Brexit. You've seen the fracturing of the global trading system, a lot of reshoring, onshoring of supply chains of people have tried to shorten them. The Ukraine-Russia conflict, war coming to Europe in a way that nobody anticipated. All the UK's interests, our predominant interests, lie with our connectivity to what is the continent, in large part, therefore, the EU. And that's what will be the underlying driver for UK politicians.
Whoever's in power.
Whoever's in power. And that logic, one hopes, will begin to show through. But come to the,
let's ditch the hope.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, let's be what realistically is possible.
So for the next time, you're absolutely right, of course. The Labour Party at the moment is terrified. It's sort of this grip on the British political psyche that Brexit have shown any positive move into the EU space. They have moved on something. So what can they do? They can do some interesting stuff. They could do a phytosanitary agreement, for example, for the non-trade anoraks. That's basically a deal on food stuff, so that you align with UK standards. So you don't need all these new checks at the border. You could do something on a youth mobility scheme, not freedom of movement. They're very clear about that, even for young people.
So call it something different.
It's time limited, visa, and all the rest of it. You could possibly do something about mutual recognition of professional qualifications, something about travelling, the musicians and so on. But all of these things are relatively modest around the central thing of getting back.
Can they be made to sound as boring as possible, so they don't inflame Brexit opinion? That's what seems to me what you want to achieve is hyper mundane, extremely technical. I love phytosanitary, a lot of that, because that actually would be part of a process.
I'm doing my best.
Of getting about.
The fact of the matter is that let's take that deal, okay? So you've all been following the saga of the border controls stuff coming from the EU into the UK. So I remember sitting in a room with some quite senior ministers in 2017, and the decision was, if there's a no deal or in a difficult transition, that we will prioritise flow of goods over revenue, i.e. Customs, and over security. And I remember ministers at the time saying, well, that's outrageous, because that will put UK producers at a disadvantage. Yeah. Well, here we are in 2024, and we still do not have those systems in place. But if Labour could come along, so Labour say, right, we'll do this phytosanitary deal with the EU, what does that mean? It requires, another little technical term for you, dynamic alignment. It will mean that the UK from here on forever will have to suck up all of the regulation in that space coming out of Brussels. And that is therefore going to be a constant bone of contention. So the future bill cashes will sit there and wibble on about having to take new regulation about standards in abattoirs, about standards for meat, and all the rest of it. But that is the invidious choice that we have to make.
We're getting some great questions. Just before we go to them, I'd like to ask you about attitudes in the EU to closer ties with the UK, because everything I've been picking up from old friends in Brussels and so forth is there's no appetite to reopen anything until they know there's some stability on this question.
So
and is that what is that your sense as well?
My sense is comes out to the point I made at the very start. Brussels is a tough negotiator. Of course, they want a good relationship with the UK. The free trade agreement, so-called, is for them quite advantageous, so they'll want to sustain that. There will be increasing interest, rightly so, in foreign policy, security, defence collaboration, because that is so necessary. But what they're not going to do is to hand out a load of free goodies, if you like, the UK, while UK politics hasn't made its mind up on where the future lies. So for a serious negotiation that gets us back somewhere closer, back into the single market, I think that is a long way off, and I think the prerequisite for that is essentially the political context in the UK. At the moment, that would be both the main parties, but in a different configuration, it might look slightly different. But the main contenders for power at UK general elections all being lined up on this being the objective. That's not going to happen for the foreseeable 5-10 years ahead.
It is. Sorry, it's quite a gloomy prognosis, isn't it? But I mean, I think it's better that that's aired and we kind of know it than that we sort of have charming wishful thinking about,
I do worry.
The clouds will part and we'll rejoin in a couple of years.
I worry that there will be expectations from incoming Labour government will be pitched too high. But just to sound a slightly more optimistic note, if you look at the demography of this question, a little bit like the demography of politics generally in the UK, but the younger generation overwhelmingly in favour of closer links with the EU. Over time, that I think will begin to play. But I'm afraid we're going to have to sit out this paralysis for a little while yet.
So it's all on the shoulders of the younger generation.
Yes, exactly.
No pressure on them. Hey, look, for the questions, do you want to get the mic to the questioners, or shall I just read out your questions? I'll just read out your questions. Someone called Claire Ramos. My sister. Actually, it's a great one, Philip. Who was responsible for the question on the referendum ballot paper?
So that is a good question.
Doesn't know the answer?
And I do know the answer to that, because ultimately the decision for it not to be yes, no, this is the crucial point, to go for leave remain, was the Electoral Commission. So part of my job, looking after the Constitution, we sponsored the Electoral Commission, independent body. They are responsible for the independent oversight of a referendum, and they opined on this, and the psephologists reckon that was probably worth a couple of % of the vote.
But they were presumably given a political instruction for in-out, because that was the Cameron framing.
That was, yes. So that was the offer, but they were not under political direction in making that decision. They thought that was the right thing to do.
They thought it was the right thing to do. All right, there's an answer. Ray Bell, what can the European movement in Scotland do effectively to bring Scotland back into the European Union? We sort of covered this in a rather heavy-hearted way, but I mean, give us a little line of hope, can we?
Think, well, if you go back, it's almost the sort of mirror image of the Eurosceptic campaign, isn't it? Something, you don't have to go back very far to the point where the notion that the UK come out of the EU was seen as quite an eccentric one. And how did that option sort of work its way through to become actually what happened? It was by long, patient, persistent political work by folk like Nigel Farage and others who ran a very successful campaign over time. Yeah. So learn from that. I mean, you're not, clearly for the opposite end, but I think the key to come back to it, that young folk who will want to see their future closer to the EU, if not back in the EU, work with that, build up that momentum.
Kind of need to work on take back control in another kind of way,
Well,
because that was such a good slogan.
I think the other thing also, you know, and again, this may be a trade secret, but anyway, I'm long enough out not for it not to matter. When we were in the sort of dark days of no deal planning, we were asked by our civil service boss to look at what could the UK do if we were in no deal to sort of rescue the economy. And we did that work, and lo and behold, the vast majority of things we were looking at to increase productivity growth in the UK ultimately came back to things that had nothing to do with the EU. It was about planning, about skills, about infrastructure, about regional inequalities, housing, all the rest of it. Actually, the refinding our confidence as a country means addressing some of those fundamentally difficult issues that underpin these massive regional and interpersonal divides in terms of prosperity that we have across the UK. Most divided country in those terms, certainly in Europe. So actually getting the country back on and giving people confidence in the future. If you think where that Brexit vote came from, a lot of people, there's very few people I think lay awake at night worrying about the competence of the European Court of Justice. An awful lot more people who put their cross in the leave box felt they had no future. This was a vote, this is a protest vote. Give them back hope.
So it's a sort of framing of an aspiration, but without talking about sunlit uplands. No,
Yes.
no sunlit uplands. Alice, I think that's Alice King-Farlow there. If there was no plan, was there at least a risk assessment? Now, you described this very quiet process led by Jeremy Hayward.
Yeah.
It's very discreet.
Yeah.
But that wasn't really a risk assessment, was it?
No,
So there's the answer. We flew into this.
Yeah.
We flew to the mountain tops without a plan.
The image I had, it was like we were setting off into this landscape. We had to climb this hill, and we knew it was a very big hill, but it was like shrouded in mist, and there was no path, there was nobody saying this is the way you go, nobody had done it before, and there was so much we had to think through without having the critical mass of understanding within the government. If you think, one illustration of that, which might amuse you all, but at one point in my tenure in
Not
Dexter,
much about this is amusing, but anyway, I'm sure we'll try.
somebody came to me and said, I think we ought to be worrying a bit more about all the international agreements that we as the UK are party to by dint of being a member of the EU. And I said, yep, that sounds fairly sensible. And said, so give me a rough ballpark. How many of those agreements are? Said, we don't know.
And sorry, were these things like an American plane landing at Heathrow kind of thing?
Or aviation, obviously trade deals, of which notoriously there were 70 or so that needed rolled over. Lots of agricultural deals, all sorts. There was 1,500 of them. So I had to create a whole new team. I mean, that was the result. They got to have created the team and worked through all of that. And then we had to decide which of those 1,500 we wanted to stay in and which we could just let go. And I think the answer was about 600. But we didn't keep a record. Why would you keep a record of all of that?
And without those things, that's to do with the functioning of the economy and society.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the most important probably were the trade deals. And let me just sort of nail something else. I've got this one. So 70 or so trade deals that were rolled over, and this was claimed as a great triumph, all right? So
even though they were basically just the same deal.
What are the new trade deals we've done? Australia, New Zealand, the Japanese deal is a little bit improved. With the big one that everybody was after was US, that's disappeared into the hills. India we're struggling with. Canada has gone backwards. But just look at the benefits of those deals. So the Australia deal, 0.08% of GDP. If we'd done a US deal, the analysis of that said it'd be worth 0.16% of GDP. I reckon you need, somebody can do the maths, 28 or 29 US type deals to compensate for the 4% loss of coming out of the single market. Now, last time I looked, there weren't 28, 29 US deals to be had because the globe isn't that big. So the notion that in all of this, that one of the Brexit freedoms was the ability to do new trade deals, and we've also done the CPTPP deal, which is a Trans-Pacific partnership thing, but that, again, the benefits of that are 0.08%, something like that. the notion that you could somehow carve out a new space that would compensate for coming out of the EU, again, we understood that that was not going to work, and so it was proved.
I don't know how we're doing for time. Where do we want to be? I know we started late. Did we want to be wrapping up quite soon? Should we take one more question? You've got one more that's come in by the proper channels. So I'm going to ask it.
My phone's recording you, so I can't use the proper chat.
Oh, okay. With a slightly heavy heart, I'll read out this question. The BBC decided, not long after the referendum, that Brexit was a done deal. Do you agree that this meant the BBC effectively censored itself? And that's really, I guess, not for you, but for me. I don't know what I mean. Well, I'll tell you what, let me buy some time. And what role, I mean, we talked a little bit about the sort of howling Brexit media. What about the BBC, actually, from your point of view?
I think it was so. David, you and I have all got sort of caught up in this sort of vortex of being part of the deep state, haven't we? Which we were talking about earlier on. So, and it's had a lot of sympathy.
I think you more than me, but anyway, we're all deep state. Actually, this is a deep state gathering, by the way.
And I think, my sense through that time was that the BBC was struggled, as it had done through the referendum and indeed through the Scottish referendum, to sustain its mission of impartiality. But of course, the BBC came under huge pressure, as did the judiciary, as did the civil service, as did business, and indeed Parliament itself. And you can see the way that this sort of insurrection, or the insurgency of Brexit, because it was founded on an article of faith, it didn't deliver the sort of transparent benefits of that. You can't turn around to Brexit and say, actually, our original concept was wrong. You've got to find reasons why that project hasn't worked. And you look at that, and the ripples of that are still spreading out. So it went through Brexit in name only, until we had then the Johnson-Frost Brexit. But then it was the EU doing us down. It was then Brexit not being implemented. And it's the civil services fault. It's all the other institutions of state. And where does that take you? We still don't know where the farther shores are of that wave rippling out. But it certainly means, I suspect, that the Conservative Party commitment, maybe at this coming election, certainly in 2029, come out of the European Court of Human Rights. You see where Liz Truss has taken this. Coming out, even like challenge it, certainly OBR, banking law, but coming out of the UN. What it's doing is dismantling all of those buttresses of the state that in a way constrain the power of the executive, which is extraordinary when you think about it. But the BBC...
And extraordinarily dangerous.
Extraordinary. When you think the BBC is one of those buttresses, hardly surprising that it was the focus of so much animus from some quarters.
I think that's all, I mean, profoundly important. And when I was in the BBC at the time, and I think a little bit like you were describing, I think because the sort of government tone was, this will be a little bit like the Scottish referendum and the government will get its way, I think that seeped into our thinking. That, this is a big and difficult question, but probably on balance, it'll remain. And I think that affected things. And then, of course, when that didn't happen, I think there was a profound feeling and concern that the accusation that the BBC was out of touch with sentiment across the country was right. And so then there was almost a kind of bending over backwards to air anything that was sort of that would help illuminate why the country had voted that way.
Can I just,
with a lasting effect, I think.
Can I just leave you a little quote, which almost ought to be there, sort of on the tombstone of some Brexiteers, but this is a Jonathan Swift quote, which sort of caught me, which was, reasoning will never make a man, sorry about the political incorrectness there, but a man correct an ill opinion, which by reasoning he never acquired. And I'm afraid that, to my mind, is the story of Brexit. This was a conviction-driven thing about sovereignty, which in itself you can understand. But that lost its moorings from the actual workings of UK society, UK economy, and our place in the world. And we're still struggling to refine those moorings. And that will be, like the good folk in this room, doing that persistent argument to illustrate and demonstrate where the UK's long-term interests lie. And that, as I said, with some emphasis, has to be with very, very close connections with our near abroad, and that in this day and age means the EU.
Let's all hope that that can be achieved. And here we are in the Peter Pan garden. There's no sort of Tinkerbell that's just going to sort this out. Sadly, I had an awful thought that maybe Liz Truss was a kind of Tinkerbell. But anyway, right. Would you all join me in thanking Philip? Thank you. And I think my last duty, it's a great pleasure, is to hand over to David Martin.
Thank you very much. I think I have to use this phone podcast. So I can speak loud enough without it.
There you go.
Can I borrow that as well? Thank you. I want to give some thanks, obviously, to David and to Philip, but I want to start firstly by thanking all of you for turning up today and being here, for Broadcasting Scotland, for organising the broadcasting of this organisation, and for South West of Scotland European Movement for making all this happen. And it's really important these events do happen for the reasons that Philip more or less concluded on, and that is that Brexit is in danger of becoming the dog that doesn't bark. And we have to make sure not only does it bark, but it keeps growling. And I want to give two examples of that. And again, this touches on something Philip was saying. At the time of the budget, the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, produced its normal documentation for the budget, and it showed that the ability of the government to either cut taxes or increase public expenditure was incredibly constrained because of Brexit, which it estimated had cut the economy by 5%, which is right in the middle of the 4 to 6% that Philip mentioned. Equally, and it goes right back to the very first comment that David himself made, I don't know if many people followed a report this week that came out that showed that the trust in politicians was at its lowest level since polling began. What most of the reports, one or two did say this, but what most of the reports didn't say, and I got a hold of the polling and dug into it, the key reason that trust in politicians has collapsed is because of the lies, distortions, and false promises made during the Brexit campaign. And it has completely destroyed trust in politicians. So for that reason, again, I repeat, it's great and it's really encouraging that all of you are here today. And I'd like to repeat what was said at the very beginning. If you're not already a member, please think about joining the European movement in Scotland. Finally, turn to David for his brilliant moderating. It was really brilliantly handled. It was almost like he had done it before. But I would, as he asked you to thank Philip, I would ask you all to thank David for what was really very well, expertly handled.
Thanks, Joe. It's a great double act.
And finally, just to thank Philip again. I mean, it's fantastic that somebody with his background, his expertise, his knowledge, his intelligence, and his commitment to this cause is prepared to come out and keep making the points, giving this information, which, all these years after Brexit, most of this should be in the public domain, but it's not as in the public domain as it should be. And the fact he's willing to come out and talk about it is such a valuable thing for the European movement. And again, to conclude, once again, let's thank Philip. Thank you.
Yeah, really good. Thank you. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it worked well, didn't it?